Good afternoon, folks, and thanks for making the time today. My name is Rob Eyler. I'm an economist, and I want to thank AFWD for sponsoring this event. I'm going to talk to you about the economy basically for the next 12 months with a large focus, and then also looking forward the next couple of years to try to give you a sense of where economists think things are going, but also to help you hopefully do some economic development, workforce development, and otherwise business planning. We're also going to talk about Modoc County specifically and look at it in the context of both the national economy, but also California. The next 12 months, most of the focus is going to be on the Biden administration of what it can and cannot get done in Congress. There's a lot of discussion about so-called fiscal stimulus number 3, which will be a package like the first two in some ways. There's a large number being thrown around DC, about 1.9 trillion. The Republicans are at about 0.6 trillion. So we'll see if that bridge gets gapped, but things at least look like they're starting in the right direction in terms of negotiations. The second fiscal stimulus round hit the street earlier this month. That's been slowly coming out in terms of checks, which have helped people that remain out of work or just simply trying to keep food on the table. It has been a tough time, and that's why they're talking about fiscal stimulus 3, is because the supposition is that no matter what we do, we're not going to quite get around the corner where we're truly recovering for maybe the next couple of months minimum. And a lot of it depends on how the vaccines continue to proliferate throughout the United States, come to California, trying to get 100, 150 million people vaccinated by sometime in summer. A lot of it's also the practices and how we engage with each other. And we can put all those things together, as we'll see in a minute. The forecast looks pretty good for this year and into the next couple of years, and basically getting around this issue and continuing on with our lives. Unfortunately, the economic damage from this situation has hit our lowest income folks the hardest. And with that in mind, there's going to be a lot of issues in terms of the types of industries that a lot of low income workers work for, and they're coming back in such a way to be able to rehire those folks. And if not, the Biden administration is actually already planning on those income groups not being able to recover as well, and thus tax rates likely having to go up to then redistribute income back down toward low income groups. We will see how that unfolds in the current Congress and potentially the next. The way economists think about the current recession and really what may or may not be happening with respect to how much longer we have until we fully recover is the way people become unemployed. So one of the things that was different this time was that a lot of people lost their job due to temporary layoffs initially in this recession. And you can see that spike on the far right-hand side. These data are the total number of people unemployed in the United States from January 2007 monthly to December 2020. So you see that big spike and then you see it going down very rapidly. Well, that's exactly what you expect when you get a lot of people who are temporarily laid off. The problem is that now had stacked onto it permanent layoffs. And some of the folks that were originally temporarily laid off have now lost their jobs permanently. For example, where I work at Sonoma State University, we had exactly that situation. We had temporary layoffs that then became permanent. This is true of a lot of employers out there. The problem now for economists and also for the greater economy is what do we do with that mixed bag of people who are unemployed? Because temporary layoffs are relatively quick to recover if that's the main way in which people remain unemployed. The more that blue color becomes part of the unemployed picture, the harder it is to fully recover. The other ways people become unemployed include completing a temporary job and then looking for a new one, leaving your job or quitting otherwise, re-entering the labor force, but not quite having a job yet, which in this scenario is a little bit different in the sense that some people actually chose to leave the labor force because they had to stay home with their kids, and that elongated the time in which they were not looking for work. And then also new entrants in the labor force, mainly high school and college graduates. Now, if we look at the industrial level and see how the United States has fared over the last almost 1 year now, over the last 10 months, we're going to start in April 2020, where most of the initial labor market damage began. And then we're going to go toward December 2020, which are the latest data until Friday morning when the new data for January come out for the US. Here's April. And you can see on the far right-hand side that most of the damage were in 3 major categories. Other services, which are like hair salons, nail salons, and a bunch of other sort of personal services industries. Food services and drinking places, all the bars and restaurants you can think of. And then accommodation, all the hotels, motels, and places where people stay overnight that you can think of. All 3 of those are dominated by relatively low wage jobs. And that's why this recession started and remains, as you'll see in a minute, dominated by low wage worker losses of jobs. But that's April. So these data are looking back 1 year and saying, what percentage of folks that were working 1 year ago in this month are currently not working? Well, there's very heavy losses initially. We leap to November 2020, looking back to November 2019, the losses are smaller, but they're still relatively historically high for food and like bars and restaurants, I'm sorry, and then hotels and motels, which are, again, the fancy words are food services and drinking places and accommodation for those industries on the far right-hand side. Much lower than where we started in April, still very, very high. And unfortunately, in December, we gave some back. We're expecting the same thing in January. January should not be much different than the December numbers, maybe a little bit up or down, but not by much. The point is those numbers should be read like this. For food services and drinking places, bars and restaurants, almost 1 out of 5 people who had a job 1 year ago in December, meaning December 2019, not working December 2020. 32 out of 100 for hotels and motels. That is a lot of people out of work. So if you look at it through that, the concentration of where economic and workforce development dollars need to flow initially is probably to pick up folks who are in career change or really struggling to continue to move forward based on their job loss in those categories. And that's why we're talking about another round of fiscal stimulus primarily. I get asked a lot about comparing this recession to past ones. And the best one, even though we started it differently, is the Great Recession in terms of comparison, because looking back to the Great Depression, or over 100 years now, with respect to what happened right after the First World War, it's a little bit of a shaky comparison because the way that our economies work now versus then, much different. Great Recession is much more similar to today. So what we're going to do on this graph is kind of show the evolution of recovery after recession has begun. We're going to start each of these graphs with the pre-recession peak, meaning the number of people that were working in November 2007 is this graph start. And you can see the Great Recession slowly unfolding over time after seasonal adjustments, bottoming out 30 months later. So think about it that way, 30 months bottoming out, which is a huge contrast to the next picture I'm going to show you. Then taking about 76 months overall to get back to the same number of workers that we started before the recession began. This is the COVID-19 situation. So a very sharp downturn, followed by initially a quick pick back up, but then a curl over, meaning that the momentum was slowed down quite a bit as we entered fall. And that ends where we are today in terms of the end of December. We need that black line to get back to the red line, just like we saw in the Great Recession, just like every recession. We need labor market recovery just to get back to where we started, to feel like that we're actually getting true momentum toward a better tomorrow. What has seen some better tomorrows has been our equity markets. And so this is the S&P 500 on a monthly basis from January 2000 to the end of 2020, the end of December. You'll notice there are 3 recessions, they're all shaded here, during those 20 years. And the first shaded area is the dot-com recession, slow downturn, even though at the time it felt like the whole market was falling apart. It ultimately was a relatively slow, wobbly downturn to the bottom and then up. Then the Great Recession, the second shaded area, is a much sharper downturn, then bottoming out, and then a huge bull market, long-term growth in trend. After that, even though there were some, real quick cuts here and there, they all recovered, including the one where we see 2652 on the far right-hand side, which is the most recent downturn in the market in March and April 2020. Then we saw amazing recovery and growth since then in equity markets. And a lot of it's driven by the fact that technology stocks are one of the main drivers in this, and low interest rates. And the combination of those two factors have really propelled the market, even though the last couple of weeks, if you're watching the news, the GameStop / hedge fund situation makes for some intriguing thoughts about the way markets are going to go forward for a little while. The fundamentals of the market remain relatively strong, assuming the economic recovery continues and the technology stocks driving this change, especially on the far right-hand side, remain high in demand. We will see. But this is something to think about in that sense. On the financial side, if you are involved in the stock market, you did not necessarily see a lot of change in your wealth. Unfortunately, a lot of low-wage workers who have not only lost their job, but are already at low wages with relatively high cost of living, especially in our urban areas, may be suffering now from the fact they don't have a lot of wealth to fall back on, even though this would have been nice for them to do. That's why all this activist stock market issues are something intriguing to watch going forward, in the sense that people who may not be able to engage otherwise are suddenly engaging, and it's leading to some really wild ways of thinking about how to engage with the markets. The other side of the financial house is on debt. And so our households have not piled up debt as economists initially thought they might in the first parts of the recession. And if we look over the last 17, 18 years, we will see here the movement of the total amount of US households debt has not changed greatly over the last few quarters. So these are quarterly data from the beginning of 2003 all the way to the third quarter of 2020. And you can see the run up of mortgage debt. So this is the predominant way in which households hold debt in terms of dollar volume, is because we buy our houses with using a mortgage. Up the hill we went, then the slow slide downhill as people reconfigured their financial lives, refinanced, lost their homes in some cases. Either way, we saw a reduction in the amount of household debt driven mainly by the total amount of mortgage debt we had outstanding. And then we saw a slow climb back up over the last few years as people got back in the market, and or we saw home prices rise and force more loans to buy the same homes again. So that's through the end of the third quarter, which means 2020, which means we had some of COVID-19 in this. Now let's walk through some other things like home equity lines of credit, auto loans, credit card loans, and let's stop here. Economists expected if there was any place where there'd be a lot of action, it would have been in credit card debt. On the mortgage side, we saw a lot of refinancing activity. So the net amount of debt change was not a lot given how much financial activity there was. But we did expect lower income workers or lower income households, period, whether they were working or not, potentially expand their use of credit cards, and that has not happened. And part of that's also because the fiscal stimulus has come and helped in terms of having those costs sitting there for households and not being covered. So credit card changes, the credit card market has not changed that much, and there's also been deferral on payments. So a lot of help came to bear since last April on trying to keep low-income households stable, and moreover, trying to keep people who own their homes stable. And for now, it's worked, and all of it's a bet on how quick this is going to work and go and actually move back toward recovery. We will see. That's student lending, and then that's other lending vehicles, as the case may be. So the financial side of the house looks pretty good. The labor side of the house is recovering, even though the last couple of months have been a little tough, and we need to get through this winter change that we knew the science told us that we were going to have these issues with respect to needing to potentially put more stay-at-home orders in place, slowing down the economic momentum through the fall and the winter. The spring looks pretty good. The IMF corroborates that outlook in the sense that they look at a global forecast for the next 2 years every January, and they're suggesting the US is going to grow at 5.1% in 2021, a little slower in 2022, but that makes a lot of sense because 2020, as you can see, there was a negative year. The Congressional Budget Office just came out with their forecast yesterday. It's basically the same numbers over a 3-year stretch when you add them all up. And generally, everybody's suggesting 3 major items. One, we're already in recovery momentum because there were so many people that had temporary job loss versus permanent job loss. That was the primary way in which people lost jobs, and they're getting them back, though some of them are converting to permanent job losers. The second piece, we've had an enormous amount of fiscal and monetary policy come to bear on the situation very quickly. In the Great Recession, it took almost 2 years from the beginning of the Great Recession to actually putting all the policy pieces together to help people out. It just took more time. This time it came together in like 2 months. So, and we've had successive rounds. If a third round comes, it'll definitely, drive a lot of this growth. The one thing is we're basically trading national debt for household debt. And whether or not we have to pay for that as a country later is a huge debate item amongst economists. And it really depends on the global financial markets continuing to purchase our debt. But for right now, the national context for California and for places like Modoc County is pretty good for 2021 and 22. Well, let's talk a little more deeply about what's going on at the state and local level by looking at some labor market data briefly. Here are some data that compare California, Modoc, Butte, and Sacramento counties, just to kind of give you a sense both locally and regionally about how things have been going. Modoc County actually has done pretty good, and as a small place in northeastern California, there's not a lot of general movement of the labor market over time. But certainly what's been imputed by the national and state level issues and global issues with COVID-19, you would expect at least some more action. Well, we got a little bit of it in the sense that we see in terms of employment, there's still some people who are, out of work. 8.9% unemployment, given the total number of people that work in Modoc County, is not a gigantic number, but it's something to watch in terms of comparison where you just don't really want a whole lot of negative change. California's 8.8%. Butte County is about 8.2. Sacramento is about 7.9. Generally speaking, Modoc County is doing okay. Again, it is a small rural place, so some of these comparisons are a little tricky, but let's dive a little deeper and kind of talk about recovery and some other issues where Modoc needs to kind of maybe keep its eyeball on what's going on. Looking at the same type of graph in terms of recovery we saw earlier with the US, now let's look at California. Here's that same bowl shape from November 2007 to where California recovered its lost jobs. And that was actually a little faster than the US. Instead of 76 months to get back to square, it took about 56 months. But this is what's happened since COVID-19 hit. And you can see it's a relatively similar movement, straight down in late spring, flat time in June, then up the ladder summer and then early fall. Last couple months, we've seen a little bit of a curl over in terms of the momentum. Same thing. We need that black line to keep moving toward the red line to truly have labor market recovery. And these data, again, are the number of months after the peak amount of employment. So it really shows the recession, if it's said right, recession and then subsequent recovery back just to square. If we look at the industrial level for California now, instead of looking just April to November and December, we're going to watch it unfold over all the months between April and December very quickly. Same deal. Looking 1 year ago, the industries and the loss of jobs and where most of the job losses concentrated. You can see leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, hotels, places where we gather for events, other services, same deal, hair salons, nail salons, etc. Concentrated job loss. Now let's walk through the months. May, June, July, August, September, October, November. Now let's stop. Notice you've got this slow progression in most of these industry categories, especially leisure and hospitality and other services. For California, we saw people make adjustments, start moving around the state, and, in a sense, continue with their lives partially. And job creation came back. Unfortunately, December gave some of that momentum back. So overall, California is still much better off than it was April, May, June. But in the major categories of loss, leisure and hospitality and other services, those losses are still very heavy and very historic. Where do most of our low-wage workers work? In those categories, unfortunately. So it's part of me. So we're watching closely. You can see on the left-hand side, farm employment has had kind of a wild year in California. A lot of that is a combination of smoke, fires, delayed harvests, supply chain issues in terms of where food and other parts of the supply chain were going to come from and complete themselves over this year because it's been so crazy, and a general cutback in agricultural employment as a result. But for the most part, those low-wage workers on the services side are still dragging, especially in places like Los Angeles County, the overall California economy down a little bit in terms of recovery. But it's been, from a social standpoint, it's been very tough because that's where, unfortunately, most of the damage has happened because of the social policies we've chosen to take on as a state and as a country. Well, let's look forward for a minute. The California Department of Finance does a forecast basically every November and December in prep for the governor's budget that the governor's office gives to the legislature to then figure out how much money we're going to spend in the following fiscal year. Well, the main forecast here is this one, which is the employment forecast, because most people are most concerned about jobs, even though income is a big deal. Jobs recovery is really the way in which we think about social issues and ultimately social policy. These data are indexed, again, to begin in November 2007 with the idea that this is really the Great Recession here, the recovery period up to that 110.5, which is basically saying that about 10.5% greater number of jobs took place between November 2007 and the beginning of 2020, which is that marker. Then we have the COVID-19 recession, and down the slope we go. But by the next quarter, we had popped back up pretty good. The key is going forward. So these data are through the end of 2024, and you can see that 110.0 on the very far right-hand side suggests that if we started the COVID-19 situation at 110.5, and we're going to end 2024 at 110.0, then it's going to take almost 5 years to basically get back the same number of jobs we had at the beginning of 2020. So like the picture I showed you before, the recovery period for this recession is being looked at as about 5 years in time with respect to labor market recovery. Now, the forecast I gave you before from the IMF and from CBO, they're suggesting that by sometime mid next year, we should have recovered all the income lost. But that's because high wage workers are still seeing growth. Low wage workers are going to, unfortunately, have a much longer slog to get back to the same number of jobs we saw. And much of that depends on structural change or not in specific industries, which I'll come back to in just a minute. Let's look at Modoc County. And it's kind of tricky when you look at rural California or rural anywhere, because especially when you compare it to the Great Recession, this is actually, believe it or not, taking some of the seasonality out of the data. So it is just a wild ride in places that are heavily seasonal in the way that they hire. But it's really the trend. So unfortunately for Modoc County, the number of jobs lost in trend after the Great Recession, which took a couple of years to sort of unwind itself, and this is also true in a lot of parts of rural, specifically northern rural California. Once jobs fell, kind of a new steady state, if you will, was established, and the jobs that were there 14 years ago never came back. Well, you can see, unfortunately, the far right-hand side suggests that because we're now about 166 months past that time. And you can see the little cut there at the end, which is the 6-month moving average to try to wipe out some of the seasonality after COVID-19. This is what it looks like not taking the seasonality out, just kind of all over the place the last 12 months. So originally a big cut, then some comeback, but then that comeback, there was some give back the last few months, and basically Modoc County is just a little bit under, and we saw that in the first graph, just a little bit under where it started the year 2020. So the good thing about that is that for a small rural place like Modoc County, there wasn't heavy job losses yet, but so much depends on what preservation tactics take place over the next few months to be able then to receive visitors, to support the local residents, and really just kind of stabilize the labor force into the medium term. Well, industrially, the way that data reported for places like Modoc County, they truncate a lot of those industry categories. But if we look April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, similar play, leisure and hospitality, heavy historic losses, some come back as the fall in summer and fall unfolded. Construction had a pretty good comeback. Trade, warehousing, utilities, transportation, where there's not a huge amount of that happening in Modoc County, at least got some of those jobs back to square. Education came back. Government was relatively stable, which was good. Generally speaking, this is a really nice picture for rural California. There are a lot of counties in rural California who have suffered greatly because of the lack of visitors and also the lack of agricultural growth. Unfortunately, there's December. So in December, there was some comeback from leisure and hospitality. Some of that's seasonal, but in other categories, things are still looking pretty good. So this picture, while unfortunate for leisure and hospitality, still looks pretty good generally across the board in Modoc County, but that's where economic development and workforce development resources should really focus its effort on bars, restaurants, and hotels and places where people gather for events, if those businesses are to be preserved. So the one beauty of that nasty picture for leisure and hospitality is it's very obvious where resources should go for Modoc County. Housing has been a bright light as well. Similar to other equity markets, housing, relies a lot on interest rates and on general outlook in middle to higher wage level households. And Modoc County over the last 12 months has actually seen positive ascension of its, well, of course, that's redundant, sorry, has seen some ascension of its median home price. And you can see it's 1.4%. And that's most of the growth that's happened over the last 2 years, I'm sorry. Rural California just doesn't see a lot of wild growth like we see in other places. You can see Sacramento County is at an absolute, on fire real estate market. Shasta County has done pretty good. Some of that is post-fire related, just like in Butte County over the last 24 months is post-fire related. These data look back 1 year and consider the percentage change in median home price, where the orange data are actually looking back 2 years. So that's a good thing. If you think about the Great Recession and how nasty home prices were in that scenario, this is a good picture. Well, the forecast is also pretty good. And everywhere across California, this sort of looks at most of the major areas that are monitored by economists in California. Really nothing here below 4.5% growth over the next year, really over 2021, which is great. Biggest opportunity cost of this happening is people getting farther and farther away from being able to buy a home if they're low to middle income workers. So while it's good if you own a home, You're not only getting preserved wealth, but you're actually getting sort of indirect wealth ascension from home prices going up for folks that are selling and people that are buying from all over the place while these houses are going up for sale. But if you are looking to get in and you just can't quite afford to get in, it's getting farther and farther away, for better or worse. Okay. Well, I spoke earlier just a little bit and alluded to the idea that low-income workers have had a much harder time recovering than higher-income workers. Well, there is a project at Harvard University that's being financed partially by the Gates Foundation to look at tracking the recovery of the economy over time. And it literally is called that. It's called Track the Recovery, all one word.org. And if you want an enormous amount of real-time data, or at least real-time estimates of the American economy, and also down to the county level in some cases, that's a place to go and check it out. These data are the recovery of low and high wage workers, where high wage workers are defined as folks that have at least $60,000 a year of wage or salary income, and low wage workers are a maximum of $27,000 a year. So you can see that from January 2020, this is the percentage change in those jobs over that period to October 22 in this case. The labor data are updated more slowly here. But a hard drop for lower wage workers, and then not much recovery, where higher wage workers took a less hard drop and also saw a little bit more recovery. So by the end of October, high wage workers, it barely changed in terms of the total job loss, where 28% of folks that make less than $27,000 a year in California had lost their job if they had one in January 2020. So that split is the meaning of a so-called K-shaped recovery. Some folks are going up, the top right leg of the K. Some folks are going down, the lower right leg of the K. And unfortunately, it's high wage and low wage is the split. Well, that split leads to rising social services demand, rising nonprofits demand, rising risk of folks staying in an apartment as a rental, and also to landlords. But really the key is keeping people in their homes, period. And then also the local economy's ability to, in a sense, rehire once the recovery becomes more obvious. So this again harkens back to the idea that labor force and its preservation is almost as important as business preservation, because if you preserve the businesses and there's nobody to hire, those businesses can't grow, and it becomes more difficult for those businesses to stay in business. On the flip side, if you don't preserve the businesses and people are still there, the workers will not have a place to go for work. So those two really need to walk hand in hand, especially in times like these where small businesses are as threatened as low-wage workers. Well, let's look at small business recovery. Same database. These data are a little bit closer to real time in the sense that this is through December 31 for California. Small business here is defined as any place that has less than 500 employees, which seems like probably complete insanity to measure something like that and call it a quote unquote small business. For most of California and most of rural California, we're really talking about businesses with less than 5 or 10 people. Maybe 37% of businesses that were open in January 2020 are not open now. Now, the problem with these data, and this is for California, is that they don't tell us whether it's permanent closure or temporary closure. What it really is measuring is the activity level of the business, such that if those economists that work for tracktherecovery.org are observing low to no economic activity for the same businesses that had economic activity per a normal business in January 2020, they count them as closed. Leisure and hospitality, maybe half of those businesses, bars, restaurants, hotels, places where people gather for events, half of those businesses closed. Temporary or permanent, we don't know. But if the longer that those businesses are closed with a relatively high percentage, the more threat that we'll have a lot of job and business problems on the other side of the next few months. You can see that split there. And especially in a place like Modoc County, where you receive a lot of visitors and you get sort of this additional full-time equivalent resident, the loss of local restaurants and hotels can be problematic. You don't want prices to rise for local residents who are there because there's less competition suddenly, or just simply no one wants to open a new business locally. And we know that businesses are going to face rising costs of operations no matter what. This is especially true in tourism industries where people are gathering together, or let's say somewhat more confined space. We're going to see a lot of public health requirements on the other side, no matter what, at least in the short term, which is going to make the cost of business to rise a little bit. Okay, well, just like we've talked about many times, The rural California has a little bit different take on a lot of these data. I'm going to now show you some recent data from the Department of Finance in California that looked at Modoc County and its evolution of its population. So this is the number of babies born over the last 20 years in Modoc County. This is the last 20 fiscal years, I should say that way. And this is the number of people who passed on. Like most of rural California, Modoc County's gotten older over time. Thus, the natural increase of the population has started to slip a little bit. There's not a lot of foreign inbounds, which is that little baby green column on the very top. And then there are some movements of people. And you can see, just like most of rural California, the 2000 to 2010 period saw people moving toward places that were more affordable, and there was more construction and just more jobs at the time. Then that faded, and it's been much more of a mixed bag in terms of the dynamics of population over the last 10 years. And this is what's happened with Modoc County's population over the last 20. And you can see over the last few years, it's been mainly slow population loss, not a whole lot of change. But why this is important is because if you think about the composition of the labor force and you think about an aging population, what you don't want to do is you don't want to slip into what you could think of as, basically a negative spiral in the labor market where people start to leave and you start trading those working families or just basically working age adults for folks that don't intend to work or may come with businesses that really don't focus on the local area, but then you don't have a population to serve those folks once they get there. That's a game that needs to get played in terms of the way that small rural California, especially northeastern California, deals with the next few years with respect to workforce and economic development. So to wrap up, let's talk about what to watch. We know low interest rates are going to continue. We should not expect anything but economic growth and ultimately the Federal Reserve to change that path, but we have to watch how much debt we build up, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Watching home prices, will we see migration of people from urban to suburban to rural California? We will see. They might actually leave California. There's a lot of stories and a lot of talk about tracking all that. We know people left the state, especially people who have been given the freedom to take their portable jobs and go some other place. We'll see how long that lasts. This V-shaped versus K-shaped recovery, the more lower wage workers are in threat of not getting their jobs back, the trickier it's going to be for there not to be some tax increases. And that can also change the dynamics of how businesses are able to stay open. So we need to watch that. It's in our urban areas where most of that pain is going to initially show its face. The public sector has been hurting. No matter what you hear, the state of California has seen a pretty good rebound, a better rebound than expected, but they're still expecting deficit spending and a need to close that gap over the next few years. Our cities and counties are just basically going to be worse off because they have fewer levers to pull. So hopefully we will see some federal funding come directly toward our states and counties. We will see, but the one saving grace is that property prices have remained relatively stable. So we're not having great recession style problems with a lot of our municipalities yet. We're hoping that we're able to stave off another crisis. But that debt thing is an issue. Right now, we're trading national debt for household debt, and we're hoping corporate debt doesn't get exacerbated to the point where we have this wild movement in bond markets that can change interest rates on their own rather than letting economic growth slowly change those interest rates like we saw in the last decade. But we will see. We also need to make sure that low-income folks manage their debt so they don't end up in a major crisis, not now, but 4 or 5 years from now. So there's a lot of financial education that we're going to have to do as well to go alongside of economic and workforce development for the next few years. Folks, that's what I have today. I'm hoping that that helps you and you're able to see the future a little bit better, at least from my vantage point. I want to thank AFWD again for sponsoring this. And if you have any questions, I'm going to wait a minute. I don't see any in the chat right now. And I'm hoping that at least a couple of you have a question or two, but if you think of a question or you don't feel like asking right now, that's okay. My contact information is here on this slide. Email me, hit me up on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle right there, the @Bobby7007. And let me know if you have any questions. And I'll just wait here for a couple more minutes or a couple seconds more. If I don't see anybody typing, that's fine. Thank you, Bright. Appreciate it. Be sure to just let me know. And otherwise, stay safe, folks, and make it a good year out there. We have a question from Sarah. What do you see as good areas for adult education to go into for jobs? Well, in the short to medium term, I think adult education is probably going to have to be in some kind of technology training. And what's tough about that is a lot of adults, unless they're relatively computer literate, can't just jump from being, okay, I was a waiter at a restaurant and now I want to learn how to do Ruby on Rails coding. it's tough to make that kind of transition. But if there are jobs in, let's say, medical billing, in something that you can do from a very inexpensive laptop at home for the short term, and that can start to build a career transition for adults, that's something to watch, because that has a way of connecting to a broader employer than, let's say, rural California may be able to provide on its own. We just don't know how travel is going to come back, and there's going to be so much competition for it that if leisure and hospitality is where a lot of the demand for adult education is, we've got to be able to think of ways to where we should not expect the same number of jobs that were there 2 years ago to come back with force over the next 2 years. Thank you for asking that question. Going once. Okay, thank you, folks. Take care.